During World War II, one of the darkest and least spoken about aspects was the forced conscription of child soldiers. Across different nations and fronts, boys as young as 12, and in some cases even younger, were thrust into the horrors of war, many of them barely old enough to understand what they were being asked to do. In Nazi Germany, as the war turned against the Third Reich, Hitler became desperate for more soldiers. The Nazi regime began to recruit boys from the Hitler Youth, an organization originally intended to indoctrinate young Germans with Nazi ideology. By 1943, with the Allies advancing, many of these boys, some as young as 14, were given rifles and sent to the front lines. The 12th SS Panzer Division, for instance, was composed mostly of boys from the Hitler Youth. These young boys were often fanatical, having been indoctrinated since childhood, but they were also tragically unprepared for the brutality of combat. Many were killed in action, sacrificed by the regime in hopeless battles. In the Soviet Union, as the Red Army fought to push back the invading Nazi forces, child soldiers became a common sight. Boys were often drafted as runners, sentries, or even combatants. Some were orphaned by the war and joined the fight as a means of survival. Others were caught up in the nationalistic fervor to defend the Soviet Union from the invaders. In Leningrad, during the infamous siege, children worked alongside adults to defend the city, dig trenches, and even fire weapons. Poland saw many children taking up arms during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, a rebellion against Nazi occupation. The Grey Ranks, an underground scouting organization, consisted largely of children and teenagers who acted as couriers, scouts, and sabotage agents. Many young boys and girls lost their lives fighting in the streets of Warsaw, hoping to liberate their country from Nazi control. In Japan, child soldiers were also forced into action. As the war dragged on and Japan faced increasing defeats, the Imperial Japanese Army began training boys in the art of combat. Some were forced into service as kamikaze pilots, young teenagers who were trained to fly planes into enemy ships in suicidal attacks. Others fought on the ground, especially during the defense of Okinawa, where schoolboys were pressed into service to fight American forces. Across the world, in occupied territories, children were often recruited by partisan groups or resistance movements. In Yugoslavia, children joined the ranks of Tito's partisans, resisting the Axis forces occupying their country. Similarly, in France, young boys joined the French resistance, conducting sabotage missions and gathering intelligence. The tragedy of child soldiers in World War II is not only that they were forced into war but that many of them never had a chance to live beyond it. Their innocence was stripped away, and for many, their childhoods ended before they had even begun. They fought for causes they didn't fully understand, driven by nationalism, survival, or simply the will of their elders. Those who survived were often left with deep emotional scars, forced to grow up amidst the carnage and chaos of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Today, their stories are a sobering reminder of the desperation of war and the devastating impact it can have on the most vulnerable, children. While many remember the valor of the soldiers who fought in World War II, it's important not to forget the young boys and girls who were caught in